companies are sensitive to you leaving them as customers and going to a new customer. Obviously, one of the reasons that you can get improved cost is because, there's competition and someone is vying for your business. And when someone's vying for your business, they're going to give you more advantageous, kind of terms or cost or service. So it's really important to leverage that. When you're picking a new supplier, you want to look at multiple people so that it's a competitive situation. And when you have that competitive situation, you can get advantage from the new supplier. You can also get advantage from the existing supplier. So, sometimes you go through this process and you end up with the same supplier, but you do it just by having them compete against alternative suppliers so that they have to sharpen their pencil. At the same time, I think it's important to really understand what capabilities you need as a company. And when you need certain quality levels or material procurement capabilities or inventory management capabilities, it's very important to have someone who has those skills, right? And, not all contract manufacturers are equal in that respect. And I think that it's really, I've seen huge differences with different suppliers. And the more your contract manufacturer is capable of managing that stuff, the less you have to do as, the company. And especially if, you're a company that's leveraging contract manufacturers, you probably don't have a deep bench to do those functions. So, that's part of the reason that you're hiring these people, basically to manage material procurement, manage assembly, manage labor, manage quality, where you're going to look at it from a much higher level.
I wouldn't underestimate the amount of energy it takes to move from one to another. So, if you're going to do a move, you gotta have basically double the resources, because now instead of one manufacturer, you've got two manufacturers, and then you've got a whole material supply chain thing, right? You've got to buy double material, or you got to take material from one vendor, give it to another vendor, kind of going back to this whole vendor relationship thing. And if a vendor is not happy that you're leaving, they might not be so cooperative. I mean, I remember a move some years back where, one of the manufacturers had developed all the tests, and then company that was trying to move said, "Hey, we're going to move." And they said, "Well, this is our test. I mean, we could sell it to you for 600,000 if you want it, but we developed the test." So, you don't even know necessarily what you're getting into until you really dig in and find out, there's IP that CM that you're, currently making stuff out you didn't even know about until you really say, "Hey, we're going to pull it out." It's like, wow, there's a lot under there we didn't even know about. So there are definitely risks to this. Yeah.
Well, and just adding to that, I'm working with a supplier right now that basically thought they could just move their product over to this new supplier, but the specifications for a lot of the, parts and, the product were kind of done by the contract manufacturer, because when they initially did it, the specs that they provided were limited. And, the CM had found sources to do these things, so there weren't even clear sources for all of the parts and all the components that were in the system. And some of these components are relatively complex things, like a camera assembly is in a product, and you don't exactly know what it is. It's working, it's fine, but now you have a new supplier and you have to go find another source for this, which is not trivial. There's that. There's making sure that the documentation is really clear, because the other thing that can happen is, if you're building your product at a facility for an extended period of time, a lot of times there are changes that are made and the original documentation isn't always updated. So if that documentation isn't updated and then you move the documentation to a new supplier, you might have an old design. And we're working with a company that is facing that right now. They moved to a facility in Mexico, and they are having all sorts of issues because they thought they had the latest design, but they didn't.
Yeah, and this kind of ties to the theme, getting a little bit off supply chain and onto systems, why PLM systems and kind of data management systems can be very, very important. If you're going to use same vendor and everybody has their tribal knowledge, not that big a deal. But as soon as you say, "Hey, I'm going to change," if you don't have your documentation in a row and you don't have it well controlled, it can be really quite painful to try and shift and then have to unwind all that documentation and figure out what's the right revision. As Wayne said, I mean, that client, I mean, they're still unwinding. And I think it's been a year that, they moved a year ago. They're still trying to figure it all out. The other thing, on tariffs, I don't know if we talked about it, but just because you move a facility, if you're still buying like parts from wherever, China, wherever the tariff is, and those sub-assemblies are still coming from that place, you're still going to have to pay tariffs. So this whole idea of you're just magically going to get rid of tariffs if you shift a, final assembly, it isn't really the case. I mean, it really depends on, what parts are coming from where, how they're coming. And if you're buying, raw materials from China and there's a 10% tariff in China or whatever that it is, it's still going to apply. So, that's another consideration. These things magically don't go away if you just shift final assembly. It's all the parts that go into the product.
Yeah. And it's complicated, and lots of times you're going to need to get lawyers involved because the way that some of these commodities are defined isn't always clear. So having people who have expertise in this area can actually have a big impact in your ability to kind of comply with the different scenarios and minimize the tariffs. But you're right, if the more value add that you can do, say in the United States, the more tariffs can be kind of avoided.
Your manufacturer is an extension of your company. So if you're shifting manufacturers, you're essentially divorcing a kind of manufacturer A and now, going to manufacturer B. And if manufacturer A isn't happy, they can make your life pretty miserable. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that there's a way sometimes it's not about moving. Sometimes it's about adding capacity and regional capacity. One of our current customers is, wanting to expand their capacity because their product is really, taking off. And, having the ability to have two facilities to build the product in this particular case is quite useful. And I think that, it's going to help them meet their full volume requirements. And it's a relatively complicated product. And that product complexity makes it difficult to kind of produce in high volume. So having two facilities able to do that is super helpful for them. And interestingly enough, there was a concern initially that the quality and the ability of the first partner was limited. And now that there's two, their performance has really stepped up and has actually improved quite a bit and become a relatively reliable supplier. So a little competition sometimes is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to that whole theme of competition. And if people are concerned that they're going to lose business, they're going to step it up and, for the most part, step it up, try harder, that kind of thing.
If you're just going to move final assembly, I think it can be a much faster process to do the transition. If you're going to change your entire supply chain, it's a much more involved thing. So I would say at the minimum, you're probably talking about maybe a 3-month process, and that's optimistic with relatively simple kind of transition of maybe existing parts. And, maybe there's board assembly that is done at the new supplier and system assembly. But if you have to develop a lot of test or you have to develop tooling, you're going to increase that period of time, and it's going to look more like 6 months to a year, to kind of get there.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think a lot of it is product dependent. I mean, if you've got a very simple IoT product, it can be done pretty quick. If you've got a product like some of the more complex products Wayne's, worked on, it can take a while, really to get it up to the speed and, kind of quality that, that you want to see. The other comment on this edition is specifically around China. There is a term called China plus one, which is kind of pretty common now, which is, kind of keeping core manufacturing in China, but then adding new capacity outside of China because of tariffs and geopolitics and all that stuff. And that's, that does seem to be a trend probably the last 3 or 4 years, that's been out there.
One other thing that is also relatively a good strategy to kind of take, especially if if there's a large mechanical component to the products, like consumer products where you have enclosures and things like that. If there's tooling, sometimes it makes sense to continue to develop tooling at your existing source, let's say in Asia, but then you relocate that tool to the region that you want to manufacture. So there's a lot of places to do kind of plastic injection molding in the US. You can move those tools that are built in Asia to the US and actually take advantage of the fact that your product is going to be built here, and then you could get that local manufacturing. So it's more of a product development kind of cycle versus, the ongoing production in
the only other comment I would say that kind of ties to this topic is what I would call supply chain resilience. And, you've got tariffs and you got geopolitics, but the concept of resilience and strategically figuring out how to mitigate risk from all these factors. Maybe it's duplicating supply in different regions, whatever the case is another big trend, kind of macro trend that is out there, where especially larger companies are really looking to make their supply chains as resilient as possible to handle all these different uncertainties that are out there.
The one thing that I would say that is a really important aspect of this, from my perspective, is I think it's really important to plan to have a pretty significant portion of the team kind of at the contract manufacturer during any kind of transition, until there is stability and until there is, kind of, the ability to kind of operate relatively independently. There's no substitute for having people on the ground dealing with the issues that will come up that could potentially hamper your ability to kind of transition.
Yeah. And when Wayne says people on the ground, I think it's also important to think about when you're doing these things, you've got operations people, which are traditionally the people that manage suppliers and supply chain people, but there's also a lot of need for engineering resources, typically, from what I've seen when you're doing these transitions, because you dig under the covers and all of a sudden the design needs to be changed or parts aren't the way they're supposed to be. So I think planning that side of it, in addition to the operations side, is important.